December 29, 1940, Washington, D.C. The air in the Oval Office is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of quiet desperation. You lean over a map as President Franklin D. Roosevelt grips his desk, his voice a low growl broadcast to the nation, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." He isn't just asking for planes, he's asking for a miracle. He's asking for an industrial nightmare for the Axis. He's asking for something that doesn't exist, a factory that could build a heavy bomber every single hour. You can almost hear the scoff from the established aircraft industry. Building a B-24 Liberator wasn't like building a sedan. It was a 30-ton, 3,000-mile range beast with over 1.2 million parts. The biggest builder, Consolidated Aircraft, could painstakingly finish one per day. You might as well ask for the moon. Ever wonder what it truly felt like to stand in a room where a nation's survival was being bet on an industrial gamble that seemed, by all logical measures, completely insane? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you find the journey we're about to take is a valuable one. Invite viewers to share where they are watching from and which invisible piece of technology or logistics fascinates them the most. Now let's pull back the curtain and uncover the story of the systems that win wars. You are standing in the nerve center of a nation waking up to a global fire. The numbers being passed to the president are terrifying. The Luftwaffe has honed its edge in Spain and Poland. The RAF is fighting for its life over London. The U.S. Army Air Corps, by contrast, is a tiny, almost boutique force. The call goes out not to the aircraft builders, they are already overwhelmed, but to the one industry that speaks the language of impossible scale, Detroit. The government essentially goes cap in hand to the automotive giants. Can you build parts for us? But one man sees this request not as a burden, but as an insult to his entire philosophy. You feel the rumble of his footsteps before you see him. Charles Cast-Iron Charlie Sorensen, Henry Ford's production genius, the man who had translated the abstract idea of the moving assembly line into a brutal, roaring reality. Sorensen flies to San Diego to inspect the Consolidated factory, the birthplace of the B-24. He watches, and he is appalled. You see what he sees: men on ladders working on static bucks or jigs, like craftsmen building a custom house. Parts are carried by hand. Sub-assemblies are slowly wheeled from one station to another. It's careful, it's precise, and to Sorensen, it's hopelessly, suicidally slow. He famously grumbles that they're building planes in a barn. On the flight back to Michigan, the entire concept of Willow Run is born in his mind. You're in the cabin with him as he and his draftsmen don't just sketch a factory layout, they sketch a new industrial religion. They aren't going to build a B-24. They are going to mass-produce it. They will break the 1.2 million part monster down into thousands of simple, repeatable steps. They won't bring the workers to the plane. They will bring the plane to the workers. When he gets back to Dearborn, he presents the vision to Henry Ford. Ford, a stubborn isolationist, has so far resisted the call to war. But this isn't a political plea. It's an engineering challenge of such monumental audacity that it appeals to his ego. The government wanted Ford to build sub-assemblies, maybe wings or fuselages. Ford slams his fist down. No, he would do the whole thing. He would show the craftsmen on the coast how it was done. He makes the impossible promise public. His factory would turn out one B-24 Liberator every single hour. It's a vow so arrogant, so beyond the bounds of known reality, that the aviation world laughs. They don't understand. You do. You see that Ford and Sorensen aren't planning to build a factory. They are planning to build a machine, a single integrated weapon in the shape of a building designed to do one thing: bury the Third Reich in aluminum. Ford's promise echoes, and the sound it makes is the immediate earth-shattering roar of 10,000 engines. You are standing on a patch of quiet farmland in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The air smells of damp soil and alfalfa. It is April 1941. Weeks later, you are standing on the same spot, but the world has been inverted. The farm is gone, swallowed by an ocean of mud, machinery, and men. This isn't a construction site. It's a full-scale industrial invasion, moving with the desperate speed of a nation that has suddenly realized it is catastrophically behind. You watch as Cast Iron Charlie Sorensen's vision is poured into steel and concrete. He isn't just building a factory, he's building his assembly line. And a building is simply the box he's being forced to put it in. He demands a straight run, an impossibly long flow of production. The architects, led by the industrial master Albert Speer, are tasked with simply containing Sorensen's brutal, linear logic. And the container they build is a monster. You're standing at the threshold of the main building. You look one way. The factory floor stretches out into a hazy, vanishing point. You look the other way. The same. This is the largest room in the world. 3.5 million square feet of uninterrupted space. You are inside a single, continuous structure over a mile long and a third of a mile wide. It is a building so vast that supervisors would soon need bicycles just to get from one end to the other. It's a structure so immense, the local weather patterns are irrelevant. The folklore begins almost immediately that the ceiling is high enough to generate its own internal rain clouds. This is the fortress. It has its own power plant that could run a medium-sized city. It has its own fire department, its own 65-man police force, a hospital, and a kitchen that can serve 30,000 meals a day. It is a self-contained industrial kingdom, built to be hermetically sealed against the outside world's friction. But the most revolutionary part isn't just its size, it's the shape. You see the blueprints, and it all makes sense. The building is a giant L. You follow the flow. One line, the mile-long leg, is where the thousands of sub-assemblies are built on a moving chain. The wings, the fuselage sections, the tail. Then you witness the magic trick, the single greatest piece of automotive arrogance applied to the sky, the 90-degree turn. This corner, a massive transfer bay, is where the giant completed sections of the B-24 are swung onto the second line. This final assembly in the half-mile-wide leg of the L is where the bomber itself is born. This was Sorensen's genius. He refused to let the plane stand still. In San Diego, workers had to climb all over a static frame. Here, Sorensen put the sky on a conveyor. The B-24 would be built like a 1941 Ford Super Deluxe, pulled by a 6,000-foot-long chain buried in the concrete floor, moving relentlessly from one station to the next. You are walking this floor just weeks before it opens. The sheer empty scale is a form of intimidation. It is a cathedral of rivets, a temple dedicated to the god of flow. It is beautiful, and it is terrifying. The fortress is complete. It is a weapon aimed at the heart of the axis, waiting to be loaded. The great doors rumble open, and the silence of the fortress is shattered. You are standing on the polished concrete floor, and the sound hits you first, not as a single noise, but as a physical pressure. It's the sound of a million rivets, the high-pitched scream of hydraulic presses, the percussive thunder of 100,000 tools hitting aluminum, all underpinned by the deep seismic groan of the master chain, pulling 6,000 feet of machinery through the floor. This is the sound of Sorensen's Automotive Skytrain coming to life. You are at the beginning of the L, the start of the mile-long run, and you see the first miracle of mass production, the fixtures. The traditional aircraft builders in San Diego had built their planes in jigs, wooden frames that were more like carpentry guides. You are looking at something different. You are looking at massive 30-ton steel structures, fixtures so precise, so rigidly engineered, that they look more like bank vaults. Ford had spent millions, a staggering sum, not on the planes, but on the tools to build the planes. This is the secret. You watch as a sheet of aluminum is pressed into one of these fixtures. It is clamped with hydraulic force. Holes are drilled not by a human eye, but by a guide pattern built into the steel. Every wing spar, every fuselage panel that comes out of this fixture is not close. It is identical. It's a level of interchangeability the craft-based aviation world had never even dreamed of. They built planes like tailors. Ford was building them like a printing press. You walk with the line. It moves relentlessly, 1.14 inches per second. You see the fuselage, split into its key components, moving along its own separate assembly line. You see the wings, also broken down, being built on a moving conveyor. This is the automotive revolution in action. You don't bring 50 workers to a static wing. You bring the wing to the 50 workers, each performing one simple, endlessly repeated task. Then you arrive at the great 90-degree turn, the grand concourse, where the sub-assemblies meet the final line. You feel the rumble as a massive overhead crane, one of 64, lifts an entire 3-ton wing section. It glides through the air, and with a precision that seems impossible, it drops perfectly onto a waiting fuselage. The bolt holes, drilled a half-mile away, line up exactly. There is no filing, no fudging it. It simply fits. You are now on the final assembly line, the half-mile leg. The B-24 is no longer a collection of parts. It is a recognizable beast, moving sideways down the hall. You walk alongside it. At one station, a team swarms the cockpit, installing the endless web of control cables. At the next, the plexiglass nose cone is bolted into place. At the next, the engines are lowered and mounted. It never stops. The traditionalists at Consolidated and Boeing are, by this point, horrified. They see this as a betrayal of the craft. They argue that this kind of speed must lead to shoddy work, that these planes will rattle apart in the air. You can almost hear their objections over the din, but they've missed the point. You see it clearly. Sorensen hasn't replaced skill with speed. He has transferred the skill from the worker to the machine. The fixtures are the real craftsman. The line is the real genius. The process, not the person, guarantees the quality. It's a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly ruthless calculation. And at the end of the line, you see it. The great rollout doors. They open, and a fully formed B-24 Liberator, smelling of fresh paint and metal, is towed out onto the airfield. The clock on the wall ticks. Another one is already right behind it. The fortress is complete. The line is moving. But you are standing in the middle of this vast, echoing hall, and you realize Sorensen's perfect machine has a ghost in it. For all its automated genius, the factory is just a 3.5 million square foot paperweight without one final component: hands, tens of thousands of them. And in 1942, the traditional labor pool of skilled male auto workers is vanishing, swallowed by the draft. You are witnessing a profound, panicked vacuum. Where will the workers come from? The answer is, they will come from everywhere. You are standing at the gates of Willow Run, and you see a social migration that is just as massive as the industrial one. This is no longer the domain of the Detroit auto worker. You watch them arrive in waves. First, you see the women. They are coming from kitchens, from classrooms, from department store counters. Just months ago, the idea of a woman handling a 30-pound rivet gun was a joke. Now you see them, 15,000 strong, pulling on trousers, tying up their hair in bandanas, and stepping onto the line. They are the Rosie the Riveters of Willow Run, and you realize they are a secret weapon the Axis never accounted for. You watch a small-framed woman, no more than 110 pounds, shimmy through a 20-inch gap to get inside a B-24 wing section. She's a wing walker, and she'll spend her entire 10-hour shift on her back, riveting the fuel tanks in a space no man could fit. It's a job that is claustrophobic, deafening, and utterly essential. You see the shift in power. Foremen who just a year ago refused to even interview women are now desperately training them for complex tasks like electrical wiring and engine installation. The women learn fast, their dexterity proving to be an asset, not a liability. You feel the tension, the awkwardness, the birth of an entirely new social dynamic happening right on the factory floor. Then, you notice the second wave. You hear the accents. They are not from Michigan. You are at the Bomber City Housing Projects, a sprawling, hastily built temporary town. This is the end of the hillbilly highway. The factory's gravitational pull is so strong it has uprooted entire families from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Appalachia. They are farmers, miners, and sharecroppers, drawn by the promise of $5 a day. They bring their culture, their music, and their fierce independence. You see the culture clash in real time, the locals versus the hillbillies, the city folk versus the rural. The factory is a melting pot, but it's one that is boiling over. At its peak, you are standing in a crowd of 42,000 people. It's the population of a small city, all dedicated to this one task. And it is chaos. The factory runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in 2 10-hour shifts. The noise is so loud, it's a physical assault. The work is mind-numbing, a single task repeated 600 times a shift. This is the brutal, unglamorous reality behind the propaganda posters. You realize Cast Iron Charlie's machine wasn't as automated as he'd hoped. The fixtures were precise, but it was a human hand that guided the drill. The line moved, but it was a human eye that spotted the flaw. The true engine of Willow Run wasn't the 6,000-foot chain in the floor. It was this new, strange, and exhausted army, the women, the migrants, the dreamers, who had become the living gears in the greatest production machine the world had ever seen. You are standing on the airfield, but the air is thick with more than just engine exhaust. It's thick with doubt. The planes are rolling off the line, a new one every 63 minutes, but you hear the whispers from the flight crews, the men who actually have to fly these things into a sky full of flak and Focke-Wulfs. The whispers are about the other bomber, the B-17, the Flying Fortress. You've seen the newsreels. The B-17 is the pinup girl of the 8th Air Force. It's a beautiful, rugged, over-engineered masterpiece. Crews love it. They paint its name on the side, and they trust it. It's a plane that can have 2 engines shot out, its tail half shredded, and still somehow limp back to England, a testament to its sheer, stubborn toughness. Then there's your B-24, the Liberator. You climb inside. It's not a graceful experience. The B-17's cockpit is comparatively roomy. The B-24 is a cramped, utilitarian tube. You are a trucker, not a knight of the air. The controls are heavy, sluggish. This thing is a beast to fly in formation. But the real problem, the source of the whispers, is the wing. You look out at that long, thin, revolutionary Davis wing. It's a high aspect ratio marvel of engineering, giving the B-24 incredible range and a higher speed. But you hear what the pilots say. If it takes a direct flak hit, that single long spar can fail, and the whole wing just folds up. The crews have a name for it. It's not the Liberator, it's the Flying Coffin. This is the central, agonizing debate of the air war. You are in the briefing room, and a pilot, his eyes red from a 10-hour mission, is yelling at a staff officer. He wants the B-17. He wants quality. He wants to survive. Now, you pull back. You leave the freezing airfields of England and return to the strategic map in Washington. You are a general, and you are not looking at one pilot. You are looking at a global war. And from here, the B-24 isn't a coffin. It's a queen on the chessboard. You see, the B-24 can fly faster, carry a heavier bomb load, and most critically, fly farther than the B-17. That Davis wing that the pilot fears. It gives the Liberator the legs to hunt U-boats deep in the mid-Atlantic Black Pit, that horrifying gap in air cover where the wolf packs were winning the war. It's the B-24, and only the B-24, that can close that gap and strangle the U-boat menace. It's the B-24 that has the range for the suicidal 2,700-mile round trip to the Ploiesti oil fields in Romania, the high-stakes gamble to cut off Hitler's fuel. The B-17 is the better plane to survive a mission in. The B-24 is the better plane to win the war with. And this is where Willow Run's philosophy becomes a strategic-level weapon. The B-17 is a product of craft. The B-24 is a product of good enough mass production. The planners at Willow Run have made a cold, brutal calculation. A B-17 grounded for a week waiting for a custom-fitted part is a strategically useless piece of metal. A Willow Run B-24 built with interchangeable parts can be patched up and thrown back in the air in a day, and if it can't, you just grab another one. You are witnessing the birth of a terrifying new doctrine. Quantity has a quality all its own. You aren't just building planes, you are building losses. You are building an air force so vast, so replaceable, that you can accept casualty rates that would have annihilated any other air force on Earth. The good enough plane, arriving by the thousands, becomes infinitely more valuable than the perfect plane, arriving by the hundred. You are no longer in Washington or on the frozen airfields of England. The year is 1944. You are in Berlin, inside the cavernous cold offices of the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production. You are, for this moment, Albert Speer. You are an architect, a logistician, a man who understands systems better than anyone in the Third Reich. And you are looking at a set of reconnaissance photographs with a feeling of cold professional dread. The photos are of American supply depots in England, but they don't show an army preparing for a desperate fight. They show waste. You see endless 3-mile-long fields of tanks, trucks, and jeeps parked bumper to bumper, exposed to the open air, as if they are a trivial resource. You read the intelligence reports from the front. A German general in Italy writes with pure disbelief that when American-flown B-24s are shot down, the crews who bail out seem unconcerned. They radio for pickup, get taken back to base, and are simply assigned a new plane. You are a man who is fighting a war of scraps. You are melting down church bells for copper and squeezing fuel from coal. And you are looking at an enemy who treats their most complex war machines as disposable commodities, like paper cups. This is the shock of abundance. It is the most powerful and terrifying weapon in the Allied arsenal, and it's invisible. It's a psychological weapon, and it is aimed directly at you. You look at the production numbers your own factories are achieving. You have, through superhuman effort, tripled German fighter production. It is a miracle of efficiency, and it is completely, utterly irrelevant. You are at a high command briefing. A Luftwaffe general is showing kill ratios. "We shot down 60 bombers on the last raid," he says with a strained pride. You look at the daily totals. The Americans and British sent 1,000. They lost 60, and you know, with the certainty of an industrialist, that they will send another 1,000 tomorrow, and the day after that. Because a factory 4,000 miles away in Michigan, a place you've only seen in blurry intelligence files named Willow Run, is building a heavy bomber every single hour. You are fighting a war against a clock you cannot see. You realize the Nazi ideology, built on the myth of superior will and masterful craft, has collided with a force it cannot comprehend. Crude, simple, overwhelming volume. You have built the Me-262, the world's first jet fighter, a technological marvel. The Americans have built a mile-long shed that buries you in aluminum. You hear the stories from your pilots. You are a Luftwaffe ace, a man with 50 kills. You've just shot the wing off a B-24, the flying Coffin, and you're diving away. You look in your mirror and your stomach drops. Behind the burning wreck, the formation is still there. But it's not just a formation, it is a wall of bombers. An entire section of the sky from 20,000 to 25,000 feet is a solid geometric block of aluminum bristling with 10,000 machine guns. You are not fighting a squadron, you are fighting a system. You are an artist, a warrior, and you are being swarmed by a factory. This is the true ideological collapse. It's the moment the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the German High Command realize that this is not a war of soldiers. It is a war of production. And they are losing it to a single factory, a symbol of a democratic mongrel nation's ability to turn its automotive industry into an unstoppable avalanche. You, Albert Speer, write it in your private reports. You know the war is over. It was not lost on the steppes of Russia. It was lost in the workshops of Detroit. August 1945. You are standing on the floor of the great factory, but the sound is wrong. The oppressive, percussive roar of 100,000 tools has faded. The 6,000-foot chain is still. You can hear your own footsteps echoing in the mile-long room. It is the sound of victory, and it is a deafening silence. The war is over. The last B-24, number 8685, built at this one facility, has rolled off the line. And just as fast as the fortress was born, it dies. You're at the factory gates. You watch the human assembly line, the 42,000 people, being dismantled. The Rosie the Riveters, the women who had proven they could build a bomber, are handed their final paychecks and a polite thank you. You see the foreman patting them on the back, telling them to go home, to return to the kitchens and classrooms they came from. Their war is over, but you see the look in their eyes. You've been given a taste of economic freedom, of a new identity, and now you're being told the dream is over. The seed of a new social revolution, the one that will bloom in the 60s and 70s, was fertilized right here in the grease and grime of the bomber line. You are in the Bomber City housing projects. The temporary town is emptying out. The hillbilly highway is now filled with families wondering where to go next. Many don't return to the farms in Kentucky. They stay, putting down roots in this new, strange, industrial landscape. They bring their culture, their resilience, and they become the bedrock of the post-war working class, but also the first victims of the Rust Belt that is to come. You see, the social upheaval Willow Run created was as permanent and as complicated as any bomb it dropped. You watch the factory itself, the great empty fortress, being sold for scrap. It's too big, too specialized, too much for a peacetime economy. It's a relic. It's bought by the automaker Kaiser Frazer, a desperate attempt to challenge the big three. You see them paint over the old signs, trying to build civilian cars in the shadow of a war machine. Then it's sold again to General Motors. For decades, it will build transmissions. The arsenal of democracy becomes a cog in the machine of suburban prosperity, before eventually falling silent again, a haunting symbol of industrial decay. Today, you stand on the same patch of land. Most of the mile-long building is gone. Part of it is a museum, the Yankee Air Museum. But its true echo isn't in the bricks and mortar. It's in the myth. The myth of Willow Run is a clean, simple story of American know-how. But you know the truth. You know it was chaotic, dirty, and profoundly difficult. It was a place of social tension, of staggering waste, and of mind-numbing labor. The miracle wasn't that it was perfect. The miracle is that it worked at all. The true legacy of Willow Run isn't the 8,085 planes. It's the system. It's the terrifying, world-changing idea that you can weaponize an entire economy. It's the blueprint for the military-industrial complex, the very system that would define the next 50 years of global power. Ford and Sorensen proved that the real invisible front wasn't just logistics, it was the assembly line itself. The roar of the engines fades, and the hum of the production line recedes into the past. You are back in the present, walking through a world that was entirely shaped by these unseen forces. The journey from that Michigan farm to the skies over Berlin wasn't just a story of a single factory or a single plane. It was the story of how a system, a philosophy of mass, of speed, of abundance, became the most decisive weapon of the modern age. We are still living in the echo of that arsenal, A world where the power of the invisible system, the line that never stops, continues to shape our lives in ways we are only just beginning to understand.